Hello. We are now live. I am your host, Nate Avery, and this is Google Enterprise Tech Live, or Get Live. This is where Googlers on our product teams can discuss what makes their products cool. We're going to go into the different features and benefits so that you, as a viewer, can get more from these products. We feel that if you know more about them and the features, then that'll make you more successful. And, you know, that's kind of the whole point of it, right? So we are really, really lucky to have a special guest here today. His name is Edward Thiel, and he's a software engineer and lead who works on Cloud Deploy. Over the last year, Cloud Deploy's had a ton of different features added. And Edward will tell us more about them, as well as show us some demos. And we're going to talk about some of the other ways that you can get more from this product. So without further ado, let's bring him in. Hey.
Hi, Nate.
Hey, Edward. All right. Tell everyone about yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Edward Thiel. I'm a tech lead for Cloud Deploy. And I'm excited to kind of talk about continuous delivery and what Cloud Deploy can do for you.
Okay. Outside of working on Cloud Deploy and making it awesome, any hobbies, anything like that?
My biggest hobby at the moment is my 10-month-old child. So that's definitely the hobby I'm most into.
Nice. Probably as it should be.
Yes.
All right. So there have been, as we stated, just a bunch of different features in Cloud Deploy. They've come out over the last year pretty fast and furious. Which are some of your favorites?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm gonna take a pivot on that. And not answer with one feature and say that I think it's really the collection of features together, that a lot of the value of a continuous delivery product is about taking practices that might exist in kind of one-off mechanisms and systematizing them into kind of a control plane that anyone can use and is repeatable. So individual, each feature is exciting and useful. Like, for example, something we'll talk about later today is verify commands, actually making sure your deployment works as it's supposed to. But there's also things like pre-deployment hooks and post-deployment hooks and canary deployments, things like that, where each one individual is valuable, but it's really their use together that gets you the most value, because it kind of builds on each other. The less stuff you have to do in a bespoke out there matter, the more value they add on to each other.
Gotcha. So it's like they're stacking on top of each other, kind of like you go to a grocery store with a bunch of coupons, and it's like, I got this one, and then this one, and then this one, and then at the end of the day, they have to pay you money.
Exactly.
Sorry, I just saw a movie about that. It was kind of nuts.
Oh, if they teach me that trick then.
Yeah, though I think they have like different systems in place now to check that.
Oh, it's unfortunate.
Yeah, everything cool they take away like that. So I guess kind of along those same lines, right? We know that it's a group of features that work together that makes this thing better, but there are a couple of features that people just maybe have seen, but they're not using enough. I mean, we have some of the metrics to show how features are being adopted. What's one of those features that you think could use a little more love?
Sure. One of the topics of today's demo will be the verify job, which I think is something we've heard a lot of people express interest to, but maybe aren't using yet. And this is, again, one of those things of bringing in something you may already do on a one-off basis, but actually making this a guarantee. So, for example, after I deploy, go through and verify that, do a basic test to make sure that the application is running, and also that your metrics look reasonable, where reasonable is up to you and may evolve over time to something very basic to something very sophisticated. And some people do this today where they'll deploy, and then the next job of the person doing the deploy is, well, I'm going to go run these things. I'm going to go run these checks. And that's great until the person forgets to run a check one time, or until we said, oh, this is what this change looks okay, but like, why does it look okay? What is the rules? What did we decide was okay? How do we encode the lessons we learned from the last outage into preventing the next one? And if things are one-off, then you kind of lose that that history. So verify is one of those commands that I'm personally very kind of passionate about. So like, when you deploy something, you need a way of actually saying like, is it correct? Is everything working the way you expect it? Not just is the binary in the runtime, but is it doing the thing you expect it to do there?
Yeah, perfect. It's like, are the metrics right? Is it red when it should be blue? Is it, all those little things, right? Is the code actually running?
Yep.
Because sometimes we can say, oh yeah, the container deployed. And there's not much more after that, right?
Exactly.
So I definitely want to dig into that verify when we get there, because I think it'll be helpful for folks to understand how they can tie their metrics into it and make that work. So let's see. I guess at this point, I think we can start our demo segment.
Sure, absolutely.
I know you have a couple, so let's get into it.
Awesome.
Why keep everyone waiting?
Cool. So this is kind of the architecture of our application. It's a very basic demo application where we've got a front-end service, which gives us a web page, which we'll show in our browser, and then a back-end service with a bunch of pods that back it, that basically return a color that we've configured. And then we'll show in the browser a stream of these colors where it's requesting every second. And then we can see kind of how our service changes as we deploy it. So to get started, let's go over to our, this is our cloud editor. And we're going to say our current color is yellow, and then we want to change this to green. And then
all right, now it looks like you're using cloud workstations, but this could just be our coding tool within the console as well, right? I mean, there's nothing super special about your editor.
Exactly. This could be anywhere. This could be on a local dev machine. This could be wherever. You're correct. This is cloud workstations. Super convenient for editing stuff. The machines are nice and powerful, and it connects to repo. So it tends to be what I go to. But you're right. It could be anything. So to start this process, all we did is went through and we changed this configuration inside our Kubernetes config, and then we just pushed it.
Right.
And we'll kind of
just normal git push. So it's the normal deal, right? Where you're moving your code from your local machine and you're saying, here it is, and you're updating your repo.
Exactly. So this kind of is the layout of the continuous delivery setup that we have here. So on the left side here is the source repository. That's where we just push to, and that has a cloud build trigger kind of set up on it, so that when it detects new code changes, it's going to automatically build that container and then deploy it to dev. And the idea here is like you're not choosing what's going on here. You're not manually kicking stuff off. Everything's kind of rebuilt every time, so you kind of have repeatability built into that pipeline.
Gotcha. Real quick, it looks like you have 3 different environments or 3 different targets. You want to talk about how this is laid out?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is set up between dev, staging, and production. So we talk about our first environment, which is dev. And the purpose of dev is essentially to take all the changes that have passed our CI process. So by now, in a real application, you've already done things like unit tests. You've already done your integration tests. That all happens CI, and that's like individual checking to make sure things are working. But as we all know, sometimes when you actually deploy stuff to a real environment, some of those tests don't actually match things correctly. So dev is kind of that first, it should look like production environment. So it's a real cluster. It's static. It may have databases. It has some persistence. Ideally, the infrastructure looks close to what you're actually using in prod. And you send everything through to dev. And if dev breaks, it's not the end of the world. It's okay. Nothing should be relying on dev. Dev's really whole job is to be like production and be okay if we break it. And the reason why it's okay if we break it is because we'll deploy the next thing to dev and the next thing and the next thing. We don't really stop for any reason. But if dev breaks, we don't take it to a next phase. That's kind of the the job of dev. So if we go over here, we can actually see this is the application running on dev, and it just finished deploying. So we switched from yellow to green. And we go over to cloud deploy, we can actually see that now a verification is in progress there. So we've deployed to dev, and now we're going to check to make sure that everything's okay.
Okay.
And in this particular case, we've done two things. We have a load test. In this case, a relatively short 20-second load test, but obviously in a real scenario, you would send more. This is one of those things that's useful to do in a dev-like environment, not useful to do in a CI process, since those are usually like one-offs, or maybe aren't running on similar hardware or in different kinds of setup. It's hard to get baselines. There are ways to do it, but this is one of the places that you can run a kind of a load test, make sure things are looking right, and then a metrics test. So this is where we're kind of looking at whatever metrics the cluster is emitting to a monitoring situation, making sure that things look correct there.
Gotcha. Oh, hey, just for a sec, I want to kind of back up and make sure that folks are kind of getting what's really cool about these environments, right? They kind of look like what you would expect in production, but I know that we're often asked the question, hey, why do I need a separate deployment specific tool when I can just deploy directly from my CI tool with like a kubectl apply? And this is pretty much why, right? So that you can have control over how the application is deployed and the verification steps and all the other things that are in between. And specifically the way Cloud Deploy is built, it works the way we work here within Google, where it's meant to progress to different stages. Is that roughly, at a high level, a good way to explain it?
Yeah, exactly. That kind of goes back to what we were talking about before about taking practices and systematizing them so that they're repeatable and consistent. So now we know, like, could you kubectl apply to dev after you check in every time? Absolutely. But what if that fails? What's the remediation procedure? How would anyone know? If different people on the team were unsure of the history of the environment and wanted to see the changes there, how would they do that? There are answers to all these questions. There, of course, you can do all of these things manually. The real value in kind of centralizing this is that everyone's doing it the same way. So if you know this deployment happened this way, you know that if you know deployment happened here, you can go into the cloud deploy and see exactly how it happened, and that it happened the same way because it's controlled by what's checked in the source control. And that if you have new people coming on the team, they're doing things the same way. If someone who's maybe not as familiar with your team, say someone comes in, they've got a small project to work on your code base, they're not having to go look up which scripts you use to get to staging, which scripts you use to get to dev. Do I send everything to dev or just a one-off? Is it a judgment call? Do I send everything to staging? What's the rules for all of that? All of those things could be inside, a README file in your directory, or they could be encoded inside a product. And I think the view we have is that putting them inside a product makes it less likely there's going to be deviations and problems, and also lets you inspect this a little bit more clearly, showing what's going on.
Nice. So it's like I'm a big fan of analogies. If you haven't noticed, when you're out bowling and you're doing like the little duck pin deals, and they've got the bumpers out there, you want to make sure that there are guardrails in place to help folks be successful, right?
Exactly.
So that's why you build it into the process itself instead of relying on folks to read and copy and paste and do things which could introduce error.
Exactly. And speaking of that, we'll show one of those guardrails right now, where we set this up to promote automatically between dev and staging. So after we passed our dev checks, we went right to staging, and that everything looks good there as well. And then we have a review required. So this was auto promoted into prod, but there's a configuration here saying, well, we actually need another human to come in and do an approval. And in this case, I'm going to go in and approve it. But depending on how your environment is structured, this could actually need to be a separate person. So another team, like a test team or a quality team, or maybe you need approvals from leads or something like that. That's kind of what this approval mechanism is for. Obviously, you can turn it off and just deploy straightforward. but that is one of those guardrails that you can have on here.
Yeah, let's just go straight to prod on a Friday. And that approval, some folks ask, how do they tie it into other things because they don't want to have to come back into the console? And the answer to that is that you can use PubSub to help trigger that.
Yes, you can use PubSub to get notifications for everything that Cloud Deploy does. So if you want to have other systems doing part of these processes, and then whatever received the PubSub event can go and interact with Cloud Deploy through our API. Virtually nothing here is kind of UI only. All of the capabilities of Cloud Deploy are accessible via our API and command line tools. So if you want to automate something, you can just go and access the API directly.
Have you seen anyone like build some cool automation thing that ties into the APIs? I mean, because that's kind of why they're there, right? Is so that you can build off of them. Anything come to mind?
There have been a couple of people that kind of really wanted Cloud Deploy to work with their workflow. So I know one or two people that have developed integrations with things like their chat client that their company uses so that they can trigger deployments based upon messaging with it. Because that's kind of how they were running things before, and they want it to run things exactly the same way after. That's probably one of the more interesting ones, since that's very different from how I've ever deployed stuff to production.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's interesting you say that because like I've read about chat ops, but I've never seen anyone actually do that, like to pull the trigger, like in a real world scenario.
Yeah, no, it's yeah. I mean, it's exciting that you can kind of use the API to let the interface be whatever makes sense for your environment.
Yeah.
Cool. So we can see this has been approved. Now it's going out to prod, and now we can say that like the next thing after we talked about what dev is for, and now what staging is for. Staging is basically I'm ready for prod. So staging environment usually should be much less flaky than dev. It should be stable. You might have people inside your company that use staging to validate features before they're going out, to test some alpha features, stuff like that. So it's kind of ready to go. Even though staging we're confident in, we still don't want to just go all to prod all at once, because as much as we like everything to be identical between these environments, there's always things that are different. And some of those we can control, like infrastructure use, but some of them we actually can't, because prod is the environment where there's real users, and users will always find different ways of using the application versus your testing infrastructure. So that's why we have a canary set up here. So you're seeing kind of an automated canary go through where it first deployed to 10% of production, ran all of those tests we talked about before. Well, it ran a metrics test, then it's going to go to 30%, and then to 100%, assuming that each step along the way, the tests come back successful. Now,
can we look at that a little bit deeper? Like, is there another view that would show us kind of what it's doing behind the scenes there?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is also a multi-target. So this prod instance is actually backed by 2 clusters. This is pretty common if you have like multi-region deployments, things like that, and you want them to all be the same. So going into that, we can see now that there's the prod 1, prod 2, and they both were deployed at Canary 10%, and we can kind of jump in further and see what has actually happened inside this one. This is prod 1. And you see it went through a deployment, went through a verify stage, it went through another deployment, and now it's another verify stage. And we can jump over here to, these are all being port forwarded, so we can go here and look at what prod is. And you can see that prod now is being canaried, so some of this is receiving our new green deployment, but most of it is still on our yellow one.
Gotcha.
And we'll go into a little more detail later about how we actually do this too, if you're interested.
Yeah, you have out of curiosity, do you have like a load balancer set up between prod 1 and 2?
Not in this setup right now, but that would be how right now these clusters are all demo clusters. They're disconnected from the internet, but absolutely you'd use something like the application load balancer to do multi-cluster load balancing if that was how you were setting things up.
Nice.
So we're going to, now that we have this change going, it's almost all the way. We're going to go and actually make our next change. We're going to go ahead and change this to red.
Hold on. Now, so when we saw it go all green, does that mean that it must have finished the verify and then progressed the canary further to the rest of the it?
It's going now. Now it went to all
Okay.
green. Yep. So now
Okay.
it's
So
doing one final check still to make sure everything's still fine.
Mhm.
But at this point, everything is deployed.
Nice. So automatically, if it passes the verification stage, it'll just go ahead and promote and go to the next part.
It will because we've told it to.
Okay.
So if we go into Cloud Deploy, we're using a preview feature called Automations, where we have a advanced full configuration here. So what that's saying is whenever these are the history of the kind of the automations that it took on our behalf, that we're going to automatically move on to the next canary phase once everything is passed for that phase. Now, to be clear, that's off by default. Everything in Cloud Deploy automation-wise doesn't do something unless you tell it to. And that's kind of for safety reasons, that you don't want to deploy something to dev and accidentally have it land in production. So we intentionally have you set up these rules saying, like, when should I move between these environments? But then, yes, these will go through automatically. And they will halt, of course, if there's a problem. So if the verify test fails, then we would stop.
Okay. Cool.
And speaking of which, I don't know if you're trying to foreshadow the next part of our demo, but we can go into here and say, and add some environment-specific configurations. This is another feature Cloud Deploy has called deployment parameters, which lets you customize the environments. Now, usually you probably wouldn't have a fail percentage configuration on your environment, but you can have other things that work in similar ways, like turning on experiments or ramping up new features or things like that you don't intend to be a failure, but nonetheless have the same thing. So that's kind of what this is trying to demonstrate.
Gotcha. And again, this is just a demo. So yeah, these things are designed to be able to turn on and break and that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're doing here is we're first applying this configuration. So we're saying, here's the new Cloud Deploy config, and everything's kind of checked in, typically, and then being deployed declaratively. Then we're going to go and create a new release, kind of the same way we did before, by just doing a git push, right? So now we'll go through and say change to red.
Look at that, adding comments in there.
Only for demos.
Only for demos, yeah. Otherwise, it's just, yeah, may change.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's because you always remember what the change was. So why would it be a problem? Cool. So this one is basically what we did before, where we were changing it to red, but also with this new configuration that's setting the percent of the requests that we're going to have this thing fail.
Okay.
And so we can step back here to look. So this is what our overall setup still looks like, where we're going dev first, and then we're going to run our load tests and our metrics test, and then see what happens. Other thing, I don't know if we talked about before, is we talked that there's an auto advance rule on the production environment so that it moves between its stages. There's also an auto promote rule that also doesn't happen by default. So if you just add dev, staging, and prod, then you have to go through and click promote or run promote command, or you can set up an auto promote rule. And this can really depend what you're trying to do as an organization. So you might say, yeah, I want everything to go to dev, but staging, I want to manually pick my releases because I have some change control process, or there's a bunch of different reasons why you might not want to auto promote. And the goal here is to give you that flexibility and control.
Yeah. Now, I know a lot of times when we talk about like the DORA metrics and everything else, we're trying to help folks get to a faster velocity, right, with their deployments. And so it would seem that manual, okay, everything kind of looks good. I've got humans looking at it and I hit promote. I mean, yeah, that can work, but it seems like that would go against the velocity. So is it, how do we do it? I mean, do we just kind of let the series of checks run, and if they're all good, then we automatically promote? Or do we have like a man in the, not in a mean way, but a man in the middle kind of checking things out?
That's a great question. So I think getting things such that you trust your automation is definitely the way is definitely what I would advise as being the preferred methodology. Saying I want to make sure that all of my tests pass and stuff, and that I have confidence that say like if my test pass, then it's probably pretty good, and I'm okay getting that to prod. That being said, this is a business process question. Like the goal of software is to deliver business value, not just to deliver software. So if your environment says, I'm in a risk averse period of time, I have a production freeze, for example, like, do you always need to deploy? No, not necessarily. And if you're not confident yet, like, let's say you're just getting metrics going for the first time and you don't know, you've been doing it by hand. I think it's kind of foolish to jump full into it right away and say like, oh, I'm just gonna trust everything. You kind of do things gradually and adopt your processes, so that over time your end state is, these things are automatically going, these things are pushing on a schedule, these things are like, humans don't need to be involved and everything will be okay. But especially if you're not coming from that place to begin with, I wouldn't recommend just skipping there because it's the right thing to do. It really should be customized to what the specific environments and challenges that your organization, your business is going through.
Nice. So it sounds like over time, what you're going to do is you'll deploy, you'll test, you'll verify, and then you go back and you increment and you test more things. And each time you're tuning the metrics or whatever the parameters are for you to determine success. And once you have that and you feel really confident in it, then you would go ahead and apply that other layer of automation to move things forward.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'd recommend if you can. There may be reasons, for example, regulatory reasons, why you need a specific person to approve a release to production, or organizational constraints that you're simply never going to change. Let's say like I need someone to approve to be the person in charge of change releases. That's also something where maybe that's your end state. So I have my recommendations for what I think end state should be, but there's also, again, the reality of what businesses need to do, and that kind of supersedes any theoretical advice, at least in my opinion.
Gotcha. Oh, real quick question. So we're starting to talk about like the metrics being one of those values that are being checked for verification.
Mhm.
Where are you getting those? I see there's like a monitoring there, but what monitoring system is that?
Great question. So that's this is in this demo. This is Cloud Operations Suite. So you're capable of Verify will let you run a arbitrary container. We have a sample container showing you how to integrate with the Operations Suite, which is what this is using. But this could be anything. So this setup is Op Suite, and we have our application kind of sending its request data to here, and we can kind of show that dashboard in a sec. Let me go over here and see. Well, actually, real quick, I want to show that this rollout just failed.
Yeah, it's all red.
So we'll see what happened here. And maybe this can be a segue into that.
Okay.
So the deployment succeeded, but then our verification failed. And we say, why did it fail? And we can go through and say that the metrics container basically said, you told me to have a max error percentage of 10%, and it was exceeded for more than 45 seconds. And that caused this release to fail.
Okay, so when you're looking at the verify log and you're looking for what failed, it's right there on the side, so you don't have to like jump out to another screen. It's there.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one other thing we'll show for this is that this is telling us kind of what you were saying before about confidence and building up over time. That verify job said it's busted, you can't go on. But you do still have the ability to override that. So we can click ignore failure here and say, we think we looked at this and said, it's okay. Now, probably 10% error rate's not okay, but that's something that you're empowered to do. And when you go back to the delivery pipeline, you'll see that since we ignored that, it now promoted itself to staging. We said, okay, a human came through and overrode the test failure, essentially.
Gotcha. Yeah. So all that's still there, right? I mean, it kind of works like in reality. If someone says, "Yep, okay, I see it. It's not that bad. Ship it anyway," you can still go ahead and do that.
Exactly.
And you can do it within the tool. Okay.
Exactly. And then you'll also note here we have some annotations attached to our pipeline. So this gives you kind of helpful links to like learn more information about what's going on. And these are free forms. You can add whatever is useful to your company, like your the link to your source repository, the links to where out triggers are set up. In this case, I want to show you the metrics dashboard because we can actually look at the data that was looking at. So we're going to go over here. And it's saying this is the last 15 minutes. And you can see this is a deployment to our dev cluster. And at first, there was no 500 errors. And after our deployment, you can see our load test is run here, so that big spike in load. But then afterwards, there's now kind of consistently 500 errors going on in our environment.
Nice. Now, yeah, this is our monitoring suite, but you said we could tie it into anything. So that could be like a Datadog or a New Relic or Prometheus. It's just kind of, dealer's choice at that point, right?
Exactly. Obviously, the dashboard looked different, but the verify job itself lets you define exactly what you want checked. And of course, there are ways that you might have standards inside your organization, but really it is kind of as you mentioned with like, would you want to use Datadog or do you want to use Prometheus? There's a lot of different options out there. So that's one of the reasons that kind of informed the design that said we would rather give you the option to pick what metrics you want. And also even what you want to trigger on. Like, do you care about 500 error rates? Do you have your own specific prober endpoints that you care about? Do you have maybe high value flows versus low value flows? There's kind of a million different ways that you could want to fail deployment based on metrics, and you kind of have the control to define that.
Nice. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing you bring up because we have had folks say, well, tell me the metrics I should use or something like that. And we're like, well, there's a nearly infinite amount of things you could check. And so at this point, it just kind of makes sense to give that control back to the user, let them figure out what makes sense in their organization. And there you go. But, I know there's been some talk of maybe trying to help folks. And this container that's already been built for Verify sounds like a pretty good start.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's exactly right. I think there are some things we need to make it easier to get started. So maybe there are common ones like 500s. This is kind of maybe I think a good example, and you can go pull that container, and that's what this demo is based on is that container. But yeah, kind of we're interested in feedback. What are people using, and what do they want? And we're kind of very interested in figuring out if there's more samples, more things that we can show people how to get started quickly.
Nice.
And on that front, this is the approval coming out again of that release. So we noticed this was a release that did fail auto push, but it passed in staging. And the reason it did that is because we had that environment specific parameter configured. And this is kind of done just to highlight that environments do always have some things that are unique to them. At minimum, there's their cluster name, right? Like where are they located? Yeah. You can even have things like networking. Like fundamentally, there are differences. So you always never, just because something passed in one environment, that gives you a lot of evidence that things will continue to go well, and you want to keep them as consistent as possible. But you do want to be cautious about not being super confident because things will always change as you go forward.
You've had to manage production environments, haven't you?
Just a few.
Yeah.
And that's the reason for this, for why we have a canary here. So we're taking this to 10% and then 20 and then 30% and then 50%, that kind of stuff. So that even though we're saying staging looks pretty good, let's just double check this before we let all of our users have access to it.
Okay. Yeah. No matter what, it'll always run through that canary phase, and you'll have the ability to either go forward or roll back or stop it based on the results of the canary.
Exactly.
Okay.
I know we mentioned before. I kind of go into how canary is working inside Cloud Deploy, because Cloud Deploy has this feature built into it. So as the author of the pipeline, or the author of the application, we didn't do anything specific other than make sure that the application works with n+1, n-1 configurations, which you pretty much should do anyway, just to deal with rolling updates in general. But once you do that, you can tell Cloud Deploy that you want to canary a particular deployment. And then what Cloud Deploy will do is, so we looked at, this is what our normal setup is. This is kind of as defined in the K8s YAML file. And then if you turn on the automated canary feature in Cloud Deploy, we'll read that backend configuration and then split out a set of canary pods. So you tell us like 10%, and then what we'll do in pod-based canary is bring up just a subset of those pods in your new version and leave all the other ones currently running. So those are getting exposed to new treatment. And then once everything kind of exceeds, you can imagine we're going to adjust these percentages over time till you're happy, and then just switch everything back to kind of what your original file says it should be.
Gotcha.
But the key thing is you don't have to do any of this kind of setup for the canary instance or anything like that. That's all handled for you.
Yeah, you just tell it what percentage you want for canary, and then it'll make it it'll make it so.
Exactly. Exactly. We can actually pop over to our source code right now and go into our Cloud Deploy YAML and kind of jump in and show you. This is what the canary config is saying. Yeah. This is just saying we have this service that we wanted to canary, and this is the backend deployment, and then map it at 10%, 30%, and then 100%.
You know what? If you don't mind, let's take a look at some other stuff in that Cloud Deploy YAML, and that gives us a chance to talk about what the Cloud Deploy YAML is and how it ties into the configuration of your pipeline.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of, I think the core of the file is pipelines, which basically describe how you're going to progress changes through a set of environments. So pipelines refer to targets, which are defined down here. In this case, targets are Kubernetes clusters. So this is our dev cluster, our staging cluster, our prod cluster. Sorry, these prod 1 and prod 2, and they're joined together into this kind of multi-target. So that's how we're getting multiple targets represented as one target. And then these are our automations, which are saying the things we want to do automatically. So those are that automatic advance, automatic promote that we had talked about. And this is one file that also, we've been talking a lot about the back end. The front end is deployed through Cloud Deploy as well. So that's what this is. A little bit less interesting for this demo, but it's kind of all in the same place.
Nice.
And that is actually one of the kind of important things on Cloud Deploy is the all in the same place bit. That, like, let's say you're a front end team or a back end team, or you're deploying things that are not Kubernetes. Having one place to manage it and click all the buttons in the same way and they all do the same thing is kind of one of the core value props.
Yeah, it's about the repeatability, right? If you're going to have something automated, it needs to be repeatable. It needs to be demonstratable. We're talking about infrastructure as code, and in this case, the infrastructure is the pipeline itself.
Exactly.
Now, we can also, this is the file that's in YAML. I know some folks are like, oh, crap, another YAML file. But there is also a GUI pipeline builder that exists.
There's a pipeline builder for simple pipelines. Generally speaking, you get something as kind of sophisticated as this with multiple stages and different values on each stage. You're probably going to want to go into YAML anyway, but you can get started with the GUI pipeline editor, and you can view all of this in the pipeline. So all of this is kind of accessible here, and also in addition to the YAML, if you really want to get into the details here.
Nice.
Since we're back here.
Yeah, sorry. Go back to that. Yeah, we can actually see the YAML that's there for the pipelines themselves, right?
Exactly. So you can see I have all the details here.
Yeah. So if you don't have direct access to the file, you'll still be able to see the file from within the console.
Exactly. And since we are here, we can now see that our kind of deployment did fail. And we can pop in kind of as we were talking about before and see, like, why did it fail? And it failed on the verify step. And it failed for the same reason that our previous one did, that the metrics were faulty. However, one thing I want to call out here is that the metrics were problematic on the Canary deployment, not necessarily on the whole thing. So let's pop over to the metrics dashboard and we'll kind of show what the value is of, or a value of Canary is. This is our overall production cluster. And we see we broke out here by deployment. So there's BE and BE Canary, which is the Canary instance. And you can see overall, the majority of our traffic is still getting sent to the BE instance, so not the Canary instance. And we've frozen in time there. So that is still serving all of our customers happily at 90% of traffic. And 10% of the traffic is seeing a degradation of 30% of it, which means that overall our production is seeing 3% degradation. But because we can focus on that, we can know that that's actually 30% of the treatment group. And we can say, okay, that's actually a problem and we need to halt it. And so we've stopped the deployment at this point.
Gotcha. So it's like anything else, right? It kind of depends on the context in which you're discussing the problem. It may be a big one, it may be a little one, but you do still have to kind of figure out the math on how much of the end user population is actually being affected by this particular error.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. But the key thing here is because we know we're looking at the Canary, our metric test is not looking at the overall at everything. Our metric test is just looking at that Canary instance and saying, oh, 30% of my Canary instance is broken. That's not, we don't expect that.
Yeah, and it sounds like a ton, but yeah, it's just, well, it's of the Canary. So it really does depend on like how large your app is, how many, just how sprawling the thing is overall. Now, kind of back to that. So we know that we hit the errors. We had the verify stopped. What happens at that point? Do we then roll back? Do we abandon it? What's the appropriate action at this point?
So this one might depend on exactly what you want to do. So at 30%, you may want to, at 10% Canary, maybe you need to go investigate some things. Maybe you need to figure things out, figure out, well, I have no idea why this is broken. Alternatively, you might want to roll back. And that's another thing that Cloud Deploy makes easy to do. So you go over to this environment that's failed, and you can just click roll back release. And then we'll pick here. This is only successful releases. So these are the most recent successful ones. So we'll go back to the one that we just approved.
Okay, so you couldn't even accidentally pick one that it failed at some point.
Correct.
Okay.
You can re-promote something that failed. So there are ways to do it. But we try to make things easier where if you're in a rollback stage, you're not usually looking to roll back to a failed instance. And it's worth noting that the rollback process can follow the Canary rules. So it can go at 10%, 30%, 50%. Gradually moving back, but by default we're going to actually skip that and say just go to stable.
So you have these options there. Gotcha.
Exactly. So we'll click this, and then because this environment requires an approval, it still goes through that check. We'll approve the rollback, and then that's now going to go and resolve that issue by bringing it back to our previous configuration.
Gotcha. So the reason for that approval there is because you're saying, look, anytime anyone tries to change anything in prod, there should be an approval that is given, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're rolling forward or back, because at the end of the day, you're actually still applying a change to prod. So therefore, it should be approved.
Exactly. And that, again, that is up to you. You can configure things, to require approvals or not. But if an approval is required, that's actually enforced via an IAM permission. So, I'm the owner of this project. I can do whatever I want. In production, it's pretty rare to have like the dev have complete control over everything. So that could be a separate person. So I might not have permission. I might be like, oh, I need to roll back, but I need someone else to go and actually approve my rollback, because all changes to production require approval of a separate team or of someone, some risk control process or something like that. Or as you mentioned before, integration with something like some third-party workflow system. Where you might, it might not be okay to be like, it's just a rollback, it's still a change. And it's worth noting that I don't have to have a failure to trigger a rollback. So it might be, Ideally our metrics found this and we caught it here. But it might be a user report where someone comes in and says, hey, this thing's broken, I need to do a rollback there. And that's, I think that's more clearly a phase where you need an approval because you're about to just make a change to production. It happens to be to an earlier version, but you are changing production.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's one of those cases where when you do have that user say, hey, this is broken for me, then you would want to look at your metrics again, look at your checks and figure out, was there a way to automatically determine that error before it shipped?
Exactly.
Nice. So how do we know it rolled back?
Well, one thing you can see is from the metrics here. You'll notice that it just refreshed.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
so this BE instance went away.
Mm-hmm.
And we're now back to our previous configuration, as you saw here, where everything was passing and everything's passing again.
Nice. Yeah. So right there, proof yep. Through the graphs. Everyone likes graphs.
Yeah, and one other thing I want to kind of show about the graphs here is that we've set our things up to forward some information about Cloud Deploy to our metrics endpoint. So like these canary instances there are kind of showing what's going on, but there's a few more things, and I think this is a useful thing to do in general, that you can go through and set things like adding our release ID. So the same release ID we have in Cloud Deploy, you can now see in your metrics. And nice. See specific ones if they're behaving differently over time. You have multiple involved, things like that. So yeah, getting all the information from Cloud Deploy into your metrics, I think really increases the observability of what's going on.
Yeah. Can we? I guess we don't pass in, or we don't have the ability to pass in annotations yet, huh?
Not specifically. You kind of can actually, and some of these actually are flowing through annotation information. So you can plumb that through, and I can actually show you how this gets plumbed through into the metrics. You do want to be a little bit cautious about doing anything automatically because there's cardinality constraints where if you have like, depending what you're using annotations for, if you're just throwing out like new IDs all the time or a bunch of different things, you might not want all that data plumbing into your metrics. So I definitely think you should be intentional about it, but core things like the release name, deployments, stuff like that is really useful.
Nice.
So because I promised you would show you how we're doing that, we can go into our YAML file and say, here is here's the pod name that's coming through. This is just Kubernetes, it's not Cloud Deploy, but Cloud Deploy puts releases on all of release labels on all of our deployments by default. You can turn this off, but with that, you can now plumb in the release ID from the labels that are attached here into this environment variable, and then we use this environment variable to feed that through into our operations suite metrics labels.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, you could get creative with that then, because you're just essentially defining what that variable is, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Nice. Oh, hey, where do we call that verification container? Can we take a look at that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the verify step itself is controlled in Scaffold. So Scaffold is kind of how you configure the actual kind of guts of the deployment to happen. So this would, if you were using it, this is just a demo showing kind of the verification features, but in real applications, we'd almost certainly be doing some templating to change our application per environment. We add some variables, even minimal things like adjusting, replica counts, things like that. Now these are all pretty much the same with a couple things replaced inside them, but we do have kind of some information about the verify steps running differently. So this is the default container. This is not under any profile. We're running two things. First, we're running a load test. So anything that does not specify a profile gets a load test configured and a verify metrics configured. This container basically is set to run in the Kubernetes cluster. So we'll launch this container there, run it, and this just says create 300 QPS for 20 seconds. This is just an open source load generation tool. So you can kind of pull that in without any Cloud Deploy specific knowledge, Cloud Deploy specific configuration. And this one is the container that we built ourselves based on the Cloud Deploy sample container, which is available on our Cloud Deploy samples repo. which queries our cloud ops metrics. This is something written by us. It does our specific thing. It's actually not super cloud deploy specific. You could run this container anywhere. And it's really just taking a set of arguments as to what resources it should look at and what it should do.
Nice. So I notice you have the arguments listed here, but I'm guessing these are all available also like in a source code repo like GitHub, and it'll list out all of the arguments that are possible.
Exactly. Exactly. On the repo there, it lists what they are and what they're doing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet.
And you'll notice that we have some different operations here set for prod and canary. And I'll show you how these are invoked in a second. But canary works a little differently because you see this here. Metric deployment name is canary. So the ones that are not for canary deployments look at all of the deployments associated with that cluster. And again, this is kind of fine for what we're doing, but you usually want to focus on kind of your applications. You want some other filter here. But for the canary one, we only want to look at our canary deployment. We don't want to look at the metrics of everything. We want to see what the thing we just deployed is. So that's why this is different than the standard metric configuration.
Nice.
And then down here,
so you're not stuck with just the one. I mean, you can really kind of tweak it and modify it as needed for your different circumstances.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then for prod, the other thing you notice is we dropped the load test, because oftentimes you don't want to run load tests in production.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes, but like most of the time you don't. So you kind of have it up to you that you might want to run. There are tests. Usually you want to ratchet up testing, but sometimes you might want to reduce the testing for production for things like load tests.
Yeah. You don't want to actually like shut out real users.
Exactly. But one kind of important thing about this flow is that the tests, other than that, are identical between dev tests and production. The only thing being different here is we're saying like what cluster to use. So this also helps in the scenario that says like, what if my application expected 10% of the errors to be 500s? That'd be odd. But you can imagine other scenarios where you expect a certain rate of bad requests or things like that. So having the same metric configuration, or at least the ability for it to be similar, so you know what the differences are between dev tests and the staging, doesn't mean you don't get to staging, or sorry, you don't get to prod and be like, oh wait, this metric looks odd. Is it odd? Like, I don't know. We never looked at these in dev. Maybe it is. Maybe it's always been like that. So I think that's another key thing here, is trying to keep your tests similar so that you have confidence when you're going to prod that things are going to pass.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm remembering some old real world situations where those sorts of things may have happened. I was like, oh yeah, that always fails.
Yeah. Always. Yeah. It's fine if something always fails, but you should know why and have it written down, right?
Exactly. Wow. All right. So where does that leave us? I guess we're able to deploy it. We're able to roll it back. I mean, we've kind of looked at a little deeper into the containers and what it's calling and how the metrics are getting there. Wow, I think that was pretty good. Let's go back to that opening slide again that kind of showed the layout.
Oh, here we go. Yep.
Yeah. All right. Now, you want to walk us through this one more time as a nice little summary?
Yeah, absolutely. And as we go through, I guess one thing to keep in mind, or at least something that how I tend to think about it is, the further along this line that you find bugs, the more painful it is, and the more damaging it is. So our goal is kind of to reduce risk at each stage. So obviously we start from the left inside that source repository, and we want our unit tests to run before we're even allowed to check in. We want end-to-end tests, basic functional tests to run there, so we don't even let changes that are just catastrophically wrong in. Obviously build breaks, things like that just shouldn't be let into the repo. And then once we do our CI integration, our real build, we're going to do a little bit more validation before we even get to our dev environment. So ideally, we've already caught a whole bunch of low, like not low value, but obvious issues before we got there. And then we get to dev. Now we're saying, okay, our container builds past whatever like checks that our CI system ran. So we think this is pretty good. Now let's go run, on real hardware that looks kind of like production. run through our tests,
Yeah.
do some load, check their metrics, make sure things look good. And then if it breaks there, like, we're kind of sad because we're going to be delayed, but like that change doesn't go on, but it's not the end of the world. Then we get to staging, and staging is now kind of a more useful environment. People internally might be using this environment to do validation. They might be testing their features. They might be doing stuff there. So we don't want it to break. But if we break it, we broke internal users. So that's kind of a little bit more painful, but not that bad. Our paying customers didn't get broken.
Right. And ideally, stage is very close to prod, or as close to prod as you can get.
Exactly. Then we go over to prod, where we need an approval, at least in this setup. And this is the first environment we have real customers, real customer data, real customers that presumably are paying us, that are going to be unhappy if we break them. So we're going to start out slowly and go to 10%, and see if everything looks good. This demo, by the way, covered the promotions that took about 5 minutes to validate them. In the real world, you'd probably make those a lot longer. So you might put it to 10% and then give it an hour or 2 hours, depending on the what you're doing. This could actually be days. You could say, like, I really want all of my customers to hit this at some point, and then I'll move on to 30%. This kind of really depends on your risk posture and how fast you want to trade these off. None of these are like hard-coded things.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, it's your risk tolerance, right? What do you need to feel confident that the business should make this change permanent, or even roll it out to begin with?
Exactly, which could also be very impactful on. It should be informed based upon the like, what's the worst case that can happen? Like, maybe you would function differently when you're deploying infrastructure components that are a bunch of other teams depend on. If you take it down, you're going to take out everyone across your company's ability to do business. Versus if you're a new application, doesn't have that many users yet, they're demanding features more frequently so they can validate that this MVP works. Maybe you do have a 5-minute canary. I think that's definitely something that should focus on a business need rather than an abstract goal of, I should deploy in 5 minutes. Like, that's it really does depend on your needs.
Nice.
So that's basically it. So we have the automated advance. So either whether it's a day, an hour, or wherever, you can still set this up to go through and gradually promote, as long as all of your tests are passing.
Nice. And that's a reliable, predictable pipeline. I mean, that's ultimately what we want. We want to make sure that the business gets the value that it's supposed to get from the application, and it can't get that if the application is deployed and it's bad. So build the checks in, use automation where possible, where it makes sense. We want to build confidence in our testing and our capability to test, and so we'll be able to tweak our values using our own parameters, right? We will give you some things to start that you can then start tweaking and modifying, but then you can also just make up your own stuff, because every environment's different, and then you go. Hopefully it should all work.
Exactly.
So I guess we're there. Wow, this has been great.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Sorry, the show is still new. I don't really know how to close it out, and I'm still feeling this stuff out here. So where do we go if we want to learn more about any of the things that you've discussed here?
Cloud Deploy's documentation should be relatively comprehensive. Has details on all of this. The sample containers that we used here for Verify, that exists on the Cloud Deploy samples repo, along with some other great samples. And maybe as a related thing, stuff we haven't had the time to talk about today that I'm also really excited about is Cloud Deploy just launched custom targets. So all these features we talked about today are built-in targets for GKE, and you can use this for Kubernetes. Custom targets let you extend this to any runtime type. We provided some samples there as well for things like Vertex AI, or using Infrastructure Manager. So you can treat them exactly the same way as you're treating GKE. You have one place to say, here's my AI models, here's my GKE deployments, here's my infrastructure, which is Terraform being deployed through Infrastructure Manager. So kind of that's definitely something that I think is awesome. And as we talked about before on like expanding like features building on top of each other, this is basically saying all these features can now apply to anything, whatever kind of you need to use, it's there.
Yeah, cool. So then, because it's like an any target, then you would still have all of these same levels of controls of promotion and rollback and verification and all of that. You're just applying it to whatever makes sense for that target.
Exactly.
Cool. All right. Well, that sounds like you have agreed to come back and give us a demo of that.
Absolutely.
All right. Awesome. All right. Yeah, it looks like we're over time. Thank you again. Yeah, I guess with that, we're going to go ahead and close it out.
All right.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks.